Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Thomas Hobbes' work, Leviathan, begins with a number of reflections on the human faculties and thought and where we get our ideas and also our impulses, our desires, our affections from. So he's going to start in chapter 1 by talking about what he calls sense. And this is a generic term encompassing all of what we typically call the five senses, and this is an absolutely foundational idea for him because he is going to say that the original of all of our thoughts is what we call sense. And he goes on to say there's no conception in a person's mind which does not have at first totally or by parts been begotten upon the organs of sense. The rest are derived from that original. And this is what we can call, in a very broad sense, a strong empiricism, saying that we get all of our conceptions, our ideas, our, if you like, knowledge from, at least in part, what comes to us from the outside, and then what we end up doing with that. It's not saying that every single idea we have corresponds immediately to an object of sense because, for example, we have dreams where weird stuff is happening that isn't real, but all of those are ultimately derived from sense. So what is sense? He says that to know the natural cause is not very necessary to the business now at hand, and I've written of the same at large, but I'm going to give you a sort of thumbnail sketch. So the cause of sense is an external body or an object, and it presses upon, he says presseth, the organ proper to each sense. Well, this is because Hobbes has a rather mechanistic conception of not just human beings, but all living things. So in some way, what's happening with our eyes is things that are outside of ourselves, and the light is pressing upon our eyes. And then hearing, okay, that kind of makes sense. Touch, taste, these we know are felt in proximity to things. Smell, the whatever they are, atoms or molecules or corpuscles or whatever your physics admits is hitting our nostrils. And he says that what happens with this is there's a mediation of nerves and other strings and membranes of the body, and it continues inward to the brain and heart, and it causes there, and he calls this a resistance or counter pressure. So not only is stuff happening to us, we're like pushing back towards it, or an endeavor of the heart. Endeavor is an important term for Hobbes. It means a motion, a very basic kind of directedness or motion to deliver itself, which endeavor because outward seems to be some matter without. And this seeming or fancy is what human beings call sense. And it's differentiated according to the different senses. So in the eye, a light or a color figure, to the ear, a sound, to the nostril, an odor, to the tongue and palate, a savor, and the rest of the body, heat, cold, hardness, softness, things that we discern from feeling. Okay, so far so good. I think everybody can follow that. We don't have exactly the same physiology of sense perception as Hobbes did in his time, but that's okay. where do we go from there? So he's actually going to criticize the schools, meaning the Aristotelians, who were saying things like there is a visible species that is a visible show or apparition or object for the eye, and then an audible one for hearing, and other types as well. And for the cause of understanding, the thing understood sendeth forth an intelligible species, an intelligible being seen. And Aristotle said something kind of like this. Aristotelians were definitely saying this. And Hobbes says, that's nonsense. That doesn't work at all. Let's go further with this more basic, mechanistic conception of things. So, sense is going to lead us to imagination. So he says that once things are in motion, they typically stay in motion. He uses the example of like dropping something into water and seeing the waves propagate. And you might say, well, wait a second. The waves stop after a while. And Hobbes would say, yes, because the motion doesn't continue on forever. It's running into kinds of resistance. So, once a body is in motion, things are slowly going to eliminate that or extinguish it, as he says. And so, when we have sense, it doesn't stop right away within our heart or brain. There's imagination that's going on. And he's going to call this decaying sense, right? So some things could be very strong, some things could be rather weak, and he's using examples like looking at an object, for example, the light of the sun, or the voice of a person, the noise of the day, and he says, the longer the time is after the sight or sense of any object, the weaker is the imagination. Why? The continual change in our body destroys in time the parts which were in sense moved, so distance of time and place has one and the same effect upon us. Okay, and then he goes on and he says, this is also called fancy. And here he's going to tell us this is a Greek term. Now, it's not actually a Greek term, and Hobbes knows it's not a Greek term because he's actually translated some Greek, right, in his time. It's phantasia, which, by the way, can mean sense impression, appearance, or imagination in classic Greek. Aristotle actually uses it in all three ways. The Stoics use it in all three ways as well. So it's a pretty common term. And he's going to say that, we have these things within ourselves. And he says that imagination is just this decaying sense, and it's found in us. It's also found in other living creatures, whether we're awake or asleep. And he goes on and he'll tell us that we also have memory. Memory seems to be something different from imagination. Hobbes will actually say, no, these are one thing, which for diverse considerations have different names. So, when we have the same sense impression multiple times, we develop memory. Imagination is the same faculty, but it's in some ways more productive. And we can have simple imaginations. He talks about having seen a person, we imagine that person. But we can also take the things that we've seen or smelled or heard, and we can put them together in different ways. And that's what he calls compounded, right? So he says, from the sight of a man at one time and a horse at another, we conceive in our mind a centaur. Or when a person compounds the image of their own person with the image of the actions of another man. For example, when a person imagines themselves a Hercules, right? Or an Alexander, which happens often to those who are much taken with reading of romances. This is a compound imagination and is a fiction of the mind. So it's not corresponding to something that we can see with our senses directly. You're not going to find a centaur, right? Although you could look at a picture of a centaur, but the picture is sort of imagination externalized, isn't it? You might even think that you remember a centaur, but your memory is probably wrong in that case, right? So we've got this faculty going, and it's coming from sense. And then what happens after that? Well, the first thing he talks about are dreams. The imaginations of those that sleep are those we call dreams. These also have been before either totally or by parcels in the sense, and because in sense the brain and nerves, which are the necessary organs of sense, are so benumbed in sleep, are not easily to be moved by the action of external objects. There can happen in sleep no imagination and therefore no dream, but what proceeds from the agitation of the inward parts of man's body, right? Which inward parts for the connection they have with the brain and other organs when they be distempered to keep the same in motion. So he talks, for example, about indigestion leading to certain kinds of dreams. I mean, ideally, if you're totally calm in your body, you shouldn't have any dreams at all. Dreams all derive from something. He talks about being cold and dreaming about fearful things. He talks about what happens when we get angry and then presumably go to sleep. We're all riled up and then we have, angry dreams. Is this a truly scientific explanation of dreams per se? No, but it does fit in with Hobbes's epistemology here. Dreams are derived from imaginations. And if we can't tell the difference between dreaming and waking life, we might believe in all sorts of things that are really just fancies of the mind. And he's going to talk about, being haunted, apparitions, all of those sorts of things that people get mixed up about, seeing spirits and dead men's ghosts walking in churchyards, which is either their fancy only or the knavery of such persons who make use of such superstitious fear to pass disguised in the night. So sometimes it's sort of like in the Scooby-Doo thing where somebody has a mask on and they're pretending to be the spooky ghost, right? But this is all derived from our imagination, ultimately. And he says that a lot of the religion of the Gentiles, that is, the Greeks and Romans, in time past came from dreams, essentially. The opinion that people have of fairies, ghosts, and goblins and the power of witchcraft, that's also coming from this. And that's, nearer to a new religion than a craft or science. So, he goes on with that. And then he also says that this ought to be the work of the schools to tell these things apart. But the schools, again, the Aristotelians, they encourage too much of this stuff. So Hobbes is going to fix that. So we got dreams coming from imagination. We also have experience. So remember that imagination and memory, same faculty, just understood in two different ways. He says that from a lot of memory comes experience. Much memory or memory of many things is called that. And then he kind of stops at that, but that's going to be an important thing later on within the text. And then he's going to end chapter 2 by talking about understanding. So he says here, there's really two important parts to this. The imagination that is raised in man or any other creature endued with the faculty of imagining, so other animals, by words or other voluntary signs, is that we generally call understanding. And so here's the first really important thing. It is common to man and beast. Animals have understanding. They communicate with each other. So Hobbes is part of a tradition that, as opposed to others in modern philosophy, for example, René Descartes, who thinks animals don't, strictly speaking, think, Hobbes will say animals think. So he is going to tell us that a dog by custom will understand the call or the rating of his master, so will many other beasts. But, now here's the second important thing, the understanding that is specific to us human beings is the understanding not only his will, but his conceptions and thoughts by the sequel and contexture of the names of things into affirmations, negations, and other forms of speech. That is what he's going to turn to as the next topic. So we are different from the other animals in that because we use speech in a different, more complex way, we have a different, more complex, fuller, potentially, understanding of things. And all of this, however, is still going back to, derived from, sense, then running through our imagination and memory, and then moving on to these other things. So this is where Hobbes begins his vast work in Leviathan.